The courtroom was silent. Everyone sat at the edge of their seats, waiting for the next move. Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in history, was standing in front of the most powerful man in the room, a judge who thought he was untouchable. But today, something was different. Today, she wasn't backing down. Seconds earlier, Judge Edward Thornton, known for his sharp tongue and quick rulings, had insulted her, dismissing her as just another political figure trying to prove herself. But Karoline wasn't just here to prove herself. She was here to expose the truth, and she had the evidence to do it. What happened next would shock everyone in that room and change the course of the case forever. As Karoline presented document after document, piece by piece, the tension built. The whispers grew louder. The defense attorney grew more agitated. And then, just when it seemed like Thornton was about to regain control, Karoline dropped a bombshell that no one saw coming. Her voice steady. She asked, "Your Honor, do you recognize this signature?" The room fell into complete silence. Thornton's face turned pale. His hands began to tremble. In that one moment, everything shifted. What was supposed to be an ordinary courtroom case had just turned into an explosive showdown. The truth was coming to light, and there was no turning back. But that was only the beginning. Stay tuned as the drama unfolds. Karoline Leavitt stepped into the courtroom, her gaze cutting through the room with sharp focus. At just 27, she was the youngest White House press secretary in history, known for her ability to handle intense media pressure and political storms. Today, however, she faced something entirely different. A corrupt system, a powerful judge, and a case that demanded justice. Her posture was poised, every step deliberate, as she moved toward the plaintiff's table. Despite her youth, there was no mistaking the determination in her eyes. She wasn't here to back down or be intimidated. She was here to win. The room was heavy with tension, the air thick with anticipation. A sense of unease buzzed through the courtroom, as if everyone knew something big was about to unfold. At the center of it all sat Judge Edward Thornton. A man with decades of experience, he was well respected and feared in this court. His sharp tongue and unpredictable rulings had earned him a reputation that sent chills down the spines of those who faced him. Yet, there was something else beneath his cold exterior, a quiet arrogance, a belief that no one could challenge him. As the case began, Karoline felt every pair of eyes on her, including the judges. He scrutinized her, not just as a lawyer representing a case, but as a symbol of youth and ambition, something he had no patience for. After a moment of silence, Thornton's voice sliced through the room. "Miss Leavitt," he began, his tone cold and dismissive. "I must ask, why send someone as young as you to this courtroom? This is a place for seasoned professionals. Not a press secretary." A gasp rippled through the room. Karoline's heart raced, but her expression remained unreadable. She had prepared for this. She'd expected the judge to challenge her, to belittle her for her age and experience. But that didn't mean she was about to let him get away with it. The tension was palpable. Karoline stood tall, not backing down an inch. She glanced around the courtroom, noting the eyes of the jury, the reporters scribbling in their notebooks, and most importantly, Robert Mitchell, the defendant. His smirk was unmistakable as he sat there, confident that this young woman wouldn't be able to stand up to the judge. But Karoline had no intention of letting him or Thornton win. "Your Honor, I am here today because I represent the truth," Karoline replied, her voice steady, cutting through the murmurs of disbelief in the room. "I'm here to present the evidence, and that's all that matters." Her words hung in the air for a moment, and for a brief second, Judge Thornton looked taken aback. It was rare for anyone to speak to him in such a direct, unflinching manner. But that was Karoline Leavitt for you. She wasn't here to be a passive observer. She was here to fight. The judge, however, wasn't about to let her get away so easily. He leaned forward, his fingers tapping the bench. "The courtroom demands precision," he said, his voice low but firm. "I trust you've come prepared, Miss Leavitt." Karoline nodded once, her hand resting on the stack of documents before her. She knew what was coming. Thornton wasn't just testing her. He was trying to make her second-guess every step she took, every word she spoke. But Karoline had the facts. She had the evidence. And today, that was all she needed. As she began to lay out the first piece of evidence, detailing fraudulent invoices and suspicious transactions tied to the defendant, she could feel the room shift. The murmurs of the crowd quieted as they listened closely. The defense attorney, sitting beside Mitchell, raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical of Karoline's ability to prove anything. But Karoline wasn't fazed. The judge may have doubted her, but she was ready, and she would show him and everyone else that the truth could not be silenced. Karoline stood tall, her gaze unwavering as she faced Judge Thornton's biting words. She had expected insults, but nothing could have prepared her for the cold dismissal that came from the bench. Despite the sting of his comment, she remained composed, every fiber of her being focused on the task ahead. She knew that losing her cool would be the last thing that would win this fight. It wasn't about proving herself to Thornton or the defense attorney. It was about the truth. Her voice was steady when she spoke, calm but firm. "Your Honor, I'm here to present the truth." The words hung in the air, clear and undeniable. Karoline wasn't here to play games, and the judge would soon understand that. She had the evidence, and she wasn't going to back down. Not today. The courtroom fell silent as she began her presentation. She opened the file before her, revealing a stack of documents. As she laid out the first piece of evidence, a fraudulent invoice linked directly to Robert Mitchell. Her fingers brushed the paper with steady precision. Karoline's movements were confident, methodical. She was in control. "This invoice," she began, her voice cutting through the tension in the room, "was issued for a project that was never completed. It's a fabrication, a lie meant to cover up the misuse of public funds." She glanced toward the jury, meeting their eyes, making sure they understood the gravity of what she was saying. Karoline had seen corruption before, but this was different. This wasn't just about a few shady deals. This was about a system built on deceit, a judge using his power to shield the wrongdoers. Judge Thornton's eyes narrowed as he studied the document. His expression was unreadable, but Karoline could feel the shift in the room. He wasn't going to make this easy for her. "Miss Leavitt," he spoke, his voice low but full of skepticism, "I trust you can explain these numbers to this court? Numbers we have seen many times before. What makes yours different?" His words were sharp, a challenge, an attempt to undermine her confidence. But Karoline wasn't shaken. She didn't flinch. She had prepared for this. She had anticipated every doubt, every question, and she was ready to answer. "This is not just a number, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady. "This is evidence of a scheme, a deliberate effort to divert funds meant for public use into private hands. And that's just the beginning." The defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit, let out a small chuckle from his seat. His expression was one of disbelief, as though he couldn't comprehend how someone so young, so inexperienced, could challenge a judge of Thornton's caliber. "I believe," he said with a smirk, "that Miss Leavitt might be overstepping her boundaries. This is hardly the sort of thing we would expect in a courtroom." Karoline shot him a look, her eyes hardening, but her voice remained calm as she addressed him. "Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. The facts are here, and I will not be intimidated by anyone trying to distract from the truth." Her words were a direct challenge not just to the defense, but to the very atmosphere of the courtroom, which had long been dominated by people who believed they could do as they pleased without consequence. The defense attorney stopped smiling. He glanced down at his papers, his brow furrowing as he realized Karoline wasn't going to back down. His confidence began to wane, and the tension in the room grew thicker. As Karoline continued to lay out the evidence, her voice unwavering, she presented another document, a bank statement that showed a transfer of public funds to Mitchell's personal account. This wasn't speculation. It was cold, hard proof of the corruption that had been festering in this case. Judge Thornton raised an eyebrow, but he didn't interrupt her this time. He studied the document, his eyes flicking from the paper to Karoline and back again. The air in the courtroom seemed to grow still, the tension building with every passing second. "It seems," Karoline said slowly, "that these funds were moved without authorization, without any documentation to justify the transaction. And this isn't the first time. There's a pattern, Your Honor, a clear pattern of embezzlement." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Karoline wasn't just presenting evidence. She was making her case, step by step, with precision and clarity. Every fact she laid out strengthened her argument, pushing Thornton into a corner. The judge shifted in his seat, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He didn't respond right away, but the look on his face told Karoline that he was starting to feel the pressure. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone younger than him, someone he thought he could dismiss. But the law didn't care about age or reputation. The law cared about truth, and Karoline had that on her side. "Miss Leavitt," Thornton finally said, his voice controlled, but there was a hint of irritation underneath. "I expect you to be more careful with your accusations. This court has heard similar stories before. Are you sure you have the full picture? Or is this simply a matter of a few bad numbers?" Karoline's heart beat steadily, but she refused to let his questions rattle her. "I don't just have numbers, Your Honor," she said, her tone firm and unwavering. "I have the truth, and it will be shown no matter what it takes." The judge didn't reply, but his fingers began to tap impatiently on the bench. Karoline didn't take her eyes off him. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let him regain control of this courtroom. The defense attorney's earlier confidence had drained away completely. He sat back in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him, his brow furrowed in thought. Karoline had done something he hadn't expected. She had forced the truth into the open, and he had no idea how to fight it. The courtroom grew even more tense as Karoline methodically laid out more evidence, each piece like a nail in the coffin for the defense's case. Her voice never wavered. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to make grand gestures. She simply presented the facts, letting them speak for themselves. And with each new piece of evidence, the walls around Judge Thornton's empire of corruption began to crumble. Karoline knew the moment had arrived. She had carefully laid out the groundwork, each piece of evidence building toward the inevitable revelation. She could feel the weight of the room, the intensity of the eyes upon her, especially the judge's cold, calculating stare. But she had no doubt. This was her moment to break the case wide open. With steady hands, Karoline slid another document across the table, her eyes briefly meeting Thornton's before returning to the paper in front of her. She flipped it open slowly, allowing the courtroom to take in the words that had just sealed the judge's fate. "This," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "is a contract signed by Robert Mitchell and Judge Edward Thornton." Her fingers hovered over the bold signature at the bottom of the page. "Your Honor," she continued, "do you recognize this?" The room was still. The air seemed to freeze as all eyes turned to the judge. Thornton's face remained expressionless, but Karoline saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He couldn't hide it. This was the moment where his carefully constructed empire of influence was about to crumble. Thornton's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, tapping his fingers on the bench. His voice was low, almost inaudible as he muttered, "I don't make a habit of memorizing every signature, Miss Leavitt." The words were meant to deflect, to regain control of the situation, but Karoline wasn't fooled. She had expected him to try to dismiss this evidence. She had known he would attempt to downplay his involvement, but it didn't matter. He couldn't escape the truth now. "I see," Karoline said, her voice steady but sharp. "But the contract is clearly in your name, and this signature, your signature, is linked directly to a transfer of millions in public funds." The tension in the room thickened as Karoline continued, unflinching. She pulled out the next piece of evidence, a bank transaction statement. "This transfer," she said, holding it up for the room to see, "shows a $3 million deposit from Mitchell's company into your personal account. No paperwork, no justification. Just money moving from public coffers into your hands." The room was silent, the murmur of disbelief from the jury growing louder as they exchanged glances. Karoline kept her eyes locked on Thornton. She didn't need to look at the jury. She didn't need to look at anyone else. She was focused on the judge, on the man who thought he could get away with everything. Thornton shifted in his chair, his fingers now visibly trembling on the bench. He cleared his throat, a small sign of the pressure mounting on him. "This court will not tolerate baseless accusations," he said, his voice now a bit more forceful. "You must provide solid proof before making such allegations." Karoline didn't flinch. She had the proof. "What more do you need, Your Honor?" she asked, her tone challenging but respectful. "I've shown you the signed contract, the bank statements, the fraudulent invoices. This is no coincidence. This is corruption, plain and simple. And you are at the center of it." She paused, letting the words sink in, letting the gravity of the moment wash over the room. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, the pressure, the stakes. But Karoline had never felt more certain. She had come here for a reason, and she was going to finish what she started. "Perhaps we should bring in an independent auditor," Karoline continued, her voice calm but carrying a weight of authority. "Someone who can verify the authenticity of these documents, ensure everything is above board. If you're confident there's nothing wrong, then you should have nothing to fear from an audit." Her suggestion hung in the air, challenging Thornton to take a stand, to prove his innocence. But Thornton was already on the defensive. His hands clenched around the bench, his face growing more tense with every word Karoline spoke. "You think you can question my authority?" he snapped, his voice rising. "I decide what evidence is admissible in this court. Not you, Miss Leavitt." The words were laced with fury, an attempt to intimidate her. But Karoline wasn't backing down. She knew what was at stake. "I'm not questioning your authority, Your Honor," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I'm simply asking for transparency. And right now, the facts are clear. You're involved in a conspiracy to defraud the public. And I will not let that go unchallenged." The courtroom was still. No one dared to speak. Karoline had said it all. She had laid the case bare, and Thornton had nowhere to hide. His attempts to control the room were failing. He was no longer the powerful figure he had once been. The truth had broken through, and it was undeniable. Thornton opened his mouth to speak again, but Karoline raised her hand, silencing him. She didn't need to hear him try to cover his tracks any longer. This wasn't just a battle in the courtroom. It was a battle for justice, and Karoline Leavitt wasn't about to let it slip away. "You've had your chance to explain," she said firmly, her eyes never leaving his. "Now it's time for the truth to come out." Thornton looked like a man who had been cornered. He leaned back in his chair, his face pale, his chest heaving with every breath. For the first time since the trial began, he seemed unsure of himself. The power had shifted. Karoline had won this round. The case was no longer just a matter of proving Mitchell's guilt. It had become a fight to expose the corruption within the very system that was supposed to uphold justice. And Karoline wasn't going to stop until every last truth came to light. The air in the courtroom had been thick with tension, every eye fixed on the battle between Karoline Leavitt and Judge Edward Thornton. But just when it seemed like the confrontation would reach its peak, the doors at the back of the room swung open with a loud creak, catching everyone's attention. Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, walked into the room. Her presence alone was enough to shift the atmosphere. Clad in a sharp black suit, her posture firm and resolute, she moved through the room with the authority of someone who had seen and fought corruption from every angle. Every step she took was calculated, her every move measured, as if she had been preparing for this very moment for years. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Journalists exchanged glances, unsure of what was happening. Mitchell's defense attorney looked up with surprise, trying to comprehend what was unfolding. But for everyone in that room, it was clear. This wasn't just another day in court. This was about to change everything. Bondi moved forward without hesitation, flanked by 2 officers from the Justice Department. Their presence made it evident that this wasn't just a symbolic entrance. This was a moment of action, a decisive statement that things were about to shift. The officers stood like sentinels behind Bondi, their eyes locked on Thornton, ready for the next move. Karoline watched, her heart racing but her expression calm. She had been waiting for this. She had known that the truth would force the hand of justice. And now, Pam Bondi was here to ensure that justice would be served. Karoline had laid the foundation, but Bondi was the one who would bring it to an end. As Bondi approached the bench, the entire courtroom went quiet. All eyes were on her, the weight of the moment hanging in the air like a storm on the horizon. Judge Thornton, sitting at the front, tried to hold onto his composure, but it was clear he had seen the writing on the wall. His face, once stern and powerful, now held a hint of panic. Without hesitation, Bondi turned to Thornton, her voice steady but full of authority. "Judge Edward Thornton," she declared, her words carrying the weight of her position. "Under my authority as the Attorney General of the United States, I declare you under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power." The courtroom erupted in shock. Gasps filled the air, the sound of disbelief echoing throughout the room. The same judge who had ruled over countless cases, who had held so much power and control, was now being publicly stripped of it. The once mighty figure of authority was now nothing more than a criminal, caught in the very system he had abused for so long. Thornton's face flushed a deep red, and his hands gripped the edge of the bench as if he could somehow hold onto the control he had lost. But it was too late. The officers stepped forward, placing the handcuffs around his wrists with an efficiency that left no room for resistance. Thornton tried to speak, his words stumbling over each other as he attempted to protest. "This is a violation of procedure. You can't do this." But Bondi didn't flinch. Her gaze never wavered from him. She wasn't interested in his excuses. "The truth has been made clear, Judge Thornton," she said coldly. "You're not above the law, no matter how long you've sat in that chair." As the officers escorted Thornton from the courtroom, the murmur of shock and disbelief began to settle into something else. A quiet sense of victory. The man who had once been untouchable was now being led out in handcuffs, his authority shattered in front of everyone who had once feared him. Karoline stood at the plaintiff's table, watching as Bondi took control of the situation. The victory was hers as much as it was Bondi's. Karoline had exposed the corruption, had laid the groundwork for this moment. But it was Bondi who had come in to finish what they had started. Bondi glanced toward Karoline, offering her a brief nod of acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Karoline had done it. She had stood tall in the face of overwhelming odds, and she had won. Karoline's heart swelled with pride, but she didn't let herself get distracted. This wasn't just a personal victory for her. This was a message. Corruption, no matter how entrenched, would not go unchallenged. No one was above the law, not even the most powerful judge in the courtroom. Karoline had been part of something much bigger than herself. As the doors closed behind Thornton, the room fell into an almost eerie silence. Karoline knew this was just the beginning. The case had shifted, but there were still many more battles to fight. But for today, she had done what needed to be done. And for the first time, she allowed herself a small, quiet smile. The courtroom had seen justice done. And that was enough for now. The courtroom erupted into chaos as the doors slammed shut behind Judge Thornton. His handcuffed figure was now a symbol of everything that had been wrong with the system, and as he was led away, the room seemed to vibrate with the energy of the moment. Reporters scrambled to capture the story, shouting questions over one another, all eager to get their shot at history. The once mighty judge was no longer in charge. Now, the spotlight was on Karoline and Pam Bondi, the women who had taken down a man who thought he could escape justice. The jurors exchanged glances, some still in disbelief, others with expressions that reflected their admiration for Karoline's courage. A few looked at her with newfound respect, as though they were seeing her in a completely new light. She was no longer just the young woman from the White House. She was a force to be reckoned with, someone who had stood up against a powerful figure and won. The quiet whispers among the jurors were filled with awe, some nodding as they processed what had just happened. The realization was sinking in. What they had just witnessed wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a moment that would go down in history. Across the room, Robert Mitchell sat slumped in his chair, his confident smirk long gone. The man who had thought he could simply ride out the trial with a few tricks up his sleeve was now facing the full force of the law. His face had drained of color as his defense attorney whispered furiously in his ear, no doubt trying to come up with some plan to salvage whatever remained of the case. But it was clear, the tables had turned, and Mitchell's time in the courtroom was quickly running out. The confidence he had once exuded was gone, replaced by a look of panic. The weight of the situation was sinking in. Outside the courtroom, the world was already reacting. News outlets were buzzing with the arrest, the story spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. Hashtags like #Leavitt Bondi and #JusticeServed exploded online as people praised Karoline and Pam Bondi for their bravery and resolve. It wasn't just a win for them. It was a win for the people who had been waiting for a moment like this. The public felt empowered, as though the balance of power had shifted in their favor. What had once seemed impossible, a judge, a figure of authority, brought to justice, was now a reality. The reaction was swift, and the message was clear. Corruption would no longer be tolerated. Karoline's name and Bondi's became synonymous with accountability. The justice system had been tested, and it had passed. The case wasn't just about proving the guilt of one man. It was about showing the world that no one, no matter how powerful, was immune to the truth. Back in the courtroom, Karoline allowed herself a brief moment of quiet reflection. She had just watched a major victory unfold, but she knew the fight was far from over. This case, this one corrupt judge, was just one part of a much larger puzzle. There was more to uncover, more people to hold accountable, and Karoline knew she couldn't stop now. Her role as a press secretary had just evolved into something bigger. She wasn't just a voice for the White House. She was a voice for justice, for the truth that needed to be heard. Karoline's phone buzzed on the table, breaking her concentration. She glanced down at the message from Pam Bondi. The words were simple but meaningful. "Great work today. This is just the beginning. More investigations are on the way. We'll keep pushing forward." Karoline smiled faintly, her fingers tapping on the phone's screen as she typed a quick reply. She knew what this meant. There were still more battles to fight, more corruption to uncover. But for now, she allowed herself to feel a sense of pride. She had done her part. She had stood up when it mattered most, and today justice had prevailed. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Karoline was ready for whatever came next. She had made history, and now she was determined to continue her work, pushing for a future where truth and transparency reigned. The work wasn't done, but today, for this brief moment, she could take solace in the fact that they had won. Outside the courtroom, the world was celebrating, and Karoline knew that this was only the beginning. The next step would come soon enough, and she would be ready to take it. The arrest of Judge Thornton sent ripples through the courtroom and beyond. The news quickly spread, igniting discussions everywhere. People from all walks of life were talking about it, and a sense of justice, long denied, began to sweep across the nation. But Karoline knew that the arrest of one man wasn't enough to change the system. This wasn't just about bringing one corrupt judge to justice. It was about dismantling a culture of corruption that had long been allowed to thrive in the shadows. Thornton's fall from power was a clear signal that no one was above the law, but Karoline knew that real change would take more than a single victory. It would take a movement, a collective effort to hold those in power accountable, no matter how entrenched they were. This was a larger battle, a fight that extended far beyond this courtroom. It was a fight to expose the people who had been hiding behind their positions of authority, using their power for personal gain. Karoline wasn't just fighting for the Trump administration or for herself. She was fighting for every American who had ever felt powerless in the face of corruption. As Karoline walked out of the courtroom, she felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She had made history today, but there was no time to dwell on it. This was only the beginning. The fight for truth, transparency, and accountability would continue, and Karoline was more determined than ever to be at the forefront. She thought about everything that had led her to this point. The years of hard work, the challenges, the moments of doubt. But today, she had proven that no amount of power could silence the truth. And she was ready to keep pushing, to keep uncovering the secrets that people in power thought they could hide forever. The next steps would be crucial. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more corruption to expose, more battles to fight, and more powerful figures who would try to stop her. But Karoline was resolute. She had seen firsthand how far people were willing to go to protect their positions. Now, she was prepared to do whatever it took to make sure the system was held accountable, to make sure the people who had been exploited would finally have their voices heard. As she settled into the back of the car, Karoline's phone buzzed with notifications from reporters and colleagues alike. She glanced at the messages, feeling a sense of satisfaction but also an undercurrent of urgency. The job wasn't over. The fight for justice was just getting started. Her mind raced with the next steps. She thought about the other investigations waiting to unfold, the other figures who would soon be exposed. And she thought about the message that today's events sent to the public. Change was possible. The system could be held accountable. The powerful could be brought to their knees just like anyone else. Karoline took a deep breath, glancing out the window as the car made its way through the streets. She had a lot of work ahead of her, but she felt something shift within her. A new strength, a new resolve. Today, she had stood up against corruption, and she had won. Tomorrow, she would keep fighting. The fight for justice wasn't about a single victory. It was about ensuring that the truth always found its way to the surface, no matter who was trying to hide it. Thanks for watching. The words flashed across her mind, though they weren't hers. She had heard that phrase many times before, at the end of countless news stories and headlines. But now, as she prepared to move forward with the next chapter of this journey, Karoline knew that there would be more stories to share. Stories of truth, of accountability, and of a system that was finally being forced to change. She smiled faintly, knowing the public would continue to rally behind her. The hashtag Leavitt Bondi was already trending. It was a reminder that they weren't alone. This fight for justice, transparency, and accountability was far from over. And Karoline would be there every step of the way, leading the charge. This was her mission, her purpose. And she would not stop until the entire system was exposed for what it truly was. The fight had only just begun.